When we imagine medieval kings, we often picture shining crowns, grand banquets, and richly decorated castles filled with gold and silk. The image of majesty has been carefully painted in portraits and passed down through legends. Yet hidden behind this glittering mask was a world that most modern people would find unbearable. For all their wealth and power, many medieval kings lived in filth, practiced disturbing hygiene habits, and suffered from diseases born from their own excesses and ignorance. The truth is that medieval hygiene was already primitive for ordinary people. Bathing was rare, streets were filled with waste, and medicine was more superstition than science. But kings, despite their access to resources, were not much different. In fact, their habits were often worse because they believed themselves above ordinary cleanliness. Many rulers embraced strange rituals, dangerous remedies, and toxic beauty practices that ended up destroying their health from within. Palaces were not the sparkling, perfumed sanctuaries they appeared to be in films. The air inside was often heavy with the stench of sweat, spoiled food, and chamber pots emptied into nearby courtyards. Rats and insects thrived in these conditions, spreading plague and infection. Yet medieval kings would sit on their thrones, covered in velvet and jewels, as if their appearances could hide the smell of rot that followed them everywhere. Some monarchs genuinely believed that bathing could make them sick, weakening the body's defenses. So they avoided water for weeks, months, or even years. Instead of cleaning themselves, they relied on perfumes, oils, and powders to mask the odor of unwashed skin. Beneath the layers of silk and fur, their bodies carried filth that no servant dared to mention aloud. Food, too, played a role in their hygiene decline. Feasts of roasted meats, greasy stews, and heavy breads filled their tables every night. With little understanding of nutrition, many kings developed foul breath, rotting teeth, and chronic digestive problems. Some used bizarre remedies for these issues, including rinses made from urine, vinegar, or even wine mixed with herbs. Instead of curing them, these treatments often made matters worse. It is easy to assume that power and privilege protected rulers from the struggles of common life. But history reveals that royal hygiene was not just lacking, it was horrifying. Their wealth allowed them to indulge in practices that seemed luxurious, but were in reality dangerous, unsanitary, and sometimes deadly. From the crowns on their heads to the dirt beneath their nails, medieval kings lived closer to decay than dignity. As we uncover their secrets, one question grows louder. If the rulers of the medieval world lived this way, how much darker could their private habits have been? One of the most shocking hygiene secrets of medieval kings was their fear of bathing. Many rulers truly believed that water could open the pores of the skin, allowing deadly diseases to enter the body. This superstition turned ordinary cleansing into a perceived threat, and so kings, the most powerful men in their kingdoms, often lived like strangers to soap and water. King James VI of Scotland, who later became James I of England, was notorious for this. Historical accounts describe him as deeply afraid of bathing, convinced that it would cause illness. He rarely washed, preferring instead to have his clothes changed often. His belief was that clean garments were enough to keep the body healthy, even if the skin beneath remained coated in dirt, sweat, and oil. Servants were said to whisper about the foul odor that clung to him, a stench that perfumes and powders could barely disguise. But James was not alone in this practice. Across medieval Europe, royal physicians discouraged frequent bathing. Even kings with access to elaborate bathhouses often refused to use them. Instead, they masked their bodies with scented oils, flower petals, and crushed herbs, hoping to cover the stench of decay with fragrance. Of course, this only created a stronger, sickly mixture of rot and perfume that followed them through their palaces. Some rulers went to strange extremes to maintain their dry cleanliness. Rather than water, they would rub their skin with linen cloths, sometimes soaked in vinegar or wine, believing this to be enough to cleanse the body. In reality, this only irritated the skin, leaving sores and infections untreated. Parasites such as lice, fleas, and mites thrived in the folds of royal clothing, crawling freely even during official court gatherings. This refusal to bathe had consequences beyond mere odor. Skin diseases, rashes, and boils plagued many kings, and their wounds often festered without proper washing. Some developed chronic infections that weakened them over time. Others suffered from dental decay so severe that their breath could reportedly clear an entire room. The irony is unavoidable. While kings commanded armies, ruled vast lands, and shaped the destinies of nations, they could not conquer their own fear of water. Their belief that bathing was dangerous condemned them to lives of filth, suffering, and humiliation. Yet this was only one layer of the horror. Some kings went even further, adopting hygiene rituals that were not just neglectful but actively disgusting. And one ruler in particular shocked history with the way he used his chamber pot. If avoiding bathing made medieval kings unpleasant, their toilet habits revealed something far worse. Royal palaces, for all their wealth, were often built without proper sewage systems. Instead of bathrooms, kings relied on chamber pots, portable containers used to collect human waste. What happened to these pots after use was nothing short of revolting. Servants were tasked with emptying them, often tossing the contents out of palace windows into courtyards or nearby streets. The result was that royal residences, including great castles, often reeked of urine and feces. Imagine entering a throne room filled with velvet, gold, and jewels, yet being assaulted by the stench of human waste seeping through the walls. King Henry VIII of England, famous for his 6 wives and ruthless reign, is also remembered for his vile hygiene. His health declined rapidly in his later years, leaving him with festering leg ulcers that produced pus and an unbearable odor. Combined with the waste-filled chamber pots that lined his chambers, his court was described as suffocatingly foul. Servants complained of the overwhelming stench, but few dared speak out, fearing his wrath. Even worse, kings sometimes used their chamber pots during meetings or feasts, without leaving the room. The belief was that royalty did not need to excuse themselves. Their bodies were too important to follow ordinary rules of decency. Guests at banquets were forced to endure not only the sight of gluttonous feasting, but also the disgusting sound and smell of the king, relieving himself only steps away. Some monarchs treated their waste as though it had no consequences. Instead of recognizing it as dangerous, they often believed it to be harmless. In truth, the lack of sanitation spread disease through their palaces. Fleas, flies, and rats fed on the filth, carrying deadly plagues from king to commoner alike. The irony was cruel. The most powerful rulers in the world lived in conditions that, by today's standards, would not even be acceptable in a stable for animals. Their palaces sparkled on the outside but rotted within, turning into prisons of sickness and stench. And yet, as horrifying as their waste habits were, even darker secrets lurked in their attempts to maintain royal beauty. Some kings went to extremes that poisoned their own bodies in the name of appearance, and the results were often gruesome. In the medieval world, kings were expected to appear strong, healthy, and commanding. Their image was as much a weapon as their armies, and every wrinkle, blemish, or scar was seen as a sign of weakness. To maintain their looks, many rulers turned to bizarre and often deadly beauty practices. What they thought preserved their majesty often slowly poisoned them instead. One of the most disturbing examples comes from the use of lead-based cosmetics. While lead poisoning is now well understood, medieval kings and nobles believed these powders and creams enhanced their appearance. They rubbed toxic mixtures onto their faces to lighten their skin, hiding blemishes and scars. Over time, these substances seeped into their bodies, causing headaches, tremors, blackened teeth, eventual organ failure. King Henry IV of Castile, for instance, was said to use ointments filled with strange minerals and metals to treat his skin problems. Instead of healing him, the treatments worsened his condition, leaving him weak and scarred. Meanwhile, other monarchs coated themselves in perfumes made from dangerous ingredients such as mercury and arsenic. These were believed to purify the skin and mask foul odors, but instead, they destroyed the body from within. Mercury, in particular, was a deadly favorite. Some kings used it to treat syphilis, a disease rampant among the nobility. Physicians would smear mercury ointments onto the skin, or even have rulers inhale mercury vapors. The result was horrific: rotting gums, missing teeth, and mental decline. Yet these kings, desperate to appear vigorous and untouchable, continued the treatments until they could no longer stand. The irony was cruel. The very men who wore crowns of gold and commanded thousands of subjects were quietly being consumed by their own vanity. Their attempts to preserve youth and hide decay only accelerated their decline. Servants reported the sight of kings with trembling hands, decaying faces, and foul breath, all hidden under layers of powders and perfumes. But vanity was not the only thing that killed them. Their gluttony, the endless feasts, the oceans of wine, the indulgence in sugar and meat created diseases that turned their bodies into prisons of pain. And one king in particular left behind a story of death so gruesome that it became infamous across history. Feasting was one of the greatest pleasures of medieval kings. Banquets stretched for hours, with tables sagging under the weight of roasted boars. Swans, venison, pies, stuffed with rare spices, mountains of bread, rivers of wine, and desserts dripping with honey and sugar. To many kings, the act of eating was not just survival, it was a performance of wealth and power. But this excess came at a terrible cost. King Henry VIII of England is perhaps the most infamous example. Obsessed with food and drink, he ate himself into a state of near immobility. By his later years, he weighed more than 400 pounds and suffered from constant pain. His body was ravaged with gout, diabetes-like symptoms, festering ulcers on his legs that oozed pus and gave off an unbearable stench. Servants reportedly gagged while tending to his sores, but none dared refuse him. His appetite had transformed the once athletic king into a grotesque figure, trapped in his own decaying body. Yet Henry was not alone. Louis IV of France was said to have gorged himself at every opportunity, often vomiting between courses so he could continue eating. This cycle of indulgence weakened his body, filling it with disease. Chronic constipation, bloated stomachs, and rotting intestines became common among royals who lived this way. Their luxurious diets, lacking in fresh vegetables or balance, left them vulnerable to scurvy, tooth decay, and digestive collapse. Some kings were so addicted to food that they quite literally ate themselves to death. One legend tells of a king who died from choking on an enormous meal, while others collapsed from strokes brought on by obesity and unchecked indulgence. Their bodies became symbols of decay, yet no servant dared to intervene. To question the king's habits was to risk death, even as everyone could see that the ruler was slowly killing himself with every feast. The smell of rotting flesh and sour wine hung around these monarchs, reminders that their wealth and power could not buy them health or dignity. But while gluttony destroyed them from the inside, there was another horror that plagued medieval kings from the outside: the crawling, biting, blood-sucking creatures that infested their royal bodies and beds. Behind the velvet curtains and golden thrones of medieval palaces lurked an enemy no king could escape. Vermin, fleas, lice, bedbugs, and rats thrived in royal chambers, feeding on the filth and neglect that surrounded even the most powerful monarchs. For all their wealth, medieval kings often lived in conditions that were little better than the peasants they ruled over. Royal clothing, though richly embroidered with jewels and fur, became a paradise for lice. Kings who avoided bathing allowed sweat, oil, and dirt to collect in the folds of their garments, providing the perfect breeding ground for parasites. Servants would sometimes burn the seams of royal robes with candles to kill lice hiding within. But the effort was pointless. Within days, the vermin returned. Beds, too, were infested. Despite being piled high with silks and feather mattresses, royal bedding often crawled with bedbugs. These insects would bite kings through the night, leaving them covered in red sores. Some rulers scratched themselves raw, creating open wounds that risked infection. The stench of unwashed sheets only added to the misery. Even worse were the rats. Palaces that lacked sewage systems became havens for rodents, which thrived on discarded food scraps and human waste thrown into courtyards. These rats carried fleas infected with the plague, and though kings were protected by guards and stone walls, they could not shield themselves from disease. Entire royal courts were brought to their knees when pestilence spread from the vermin that lived alongside them. Some rulers tried desperate remedies. Oils, herbs, and perfumes were sprinkled across rooms to drive away insects. Kings even kept cats or small dogs in their chambers to hunt rats. But nothing worked completely. Insects and rodents remained constant companions, whispering of decay in the shadows of gilded halls. The image of kings ruling from grand palaces loses its shine when one imagines them scratching at lice under their crowns or swatting fleas during royal ceremonies. Their power could not protect them from the most humiliating truths of their own bodies. Yet, as terrible as lice and rats were, they were nothing compared to the diseases that spread through these rulers. Illnesses made worse by their own hygiene choices. And some kings died in ways so gruesome, so revolting, that even their subjects recoiled in horror. Among the most infamous royal deaths of the medieval world was that of King Henry I of England. His end was not glorious on the battlefield or noble in old age, but humiliating and deeply disgusting. According to chroniclers, Henry died in 1135 after devouring a meal of lampreys, slimy eel-like fish considered a delicacy at the time. He ate so many that his stomach gave out, and he collapsed in agony. For days he suffered, his body racked with pain, until he finally died. But Henry I was not alone in meeting such a revolting fate. History is filled with stories of kings whose deaths revealed just how filthy their lives had been. Some rulers, plagued by constipation, died when their swollen intestines ruptured. Others rotted alive from infected wounds that festered without proper cleaning. Their bodies swelled, turned black, and emitted foul odors that horrified even the hardened physicians of their courts. One especially gruesome case was Philip II of Spain, who died in 1598 after suffering years of gout, fever, and festering sores. By the end, his body was so diseased that worms were said to have crawled from his flesh while he was still alive. Servants gagged as they tried to care for him, covering their noses against the stench of decay. His final days were a nightmare, not of royal dignity, but of filth, suffering, and humiliation. These deaths shocked their subjects, who saw them as punishments for sin or warnings from God. How could the most powerful men in the land, wrapped in crowns and surrounded by priests, die in such revolting ways? To commoners, it seemed as though the filth kings carried in life finally consumed them in death. The irony was stark. Kings who ruled over thousands, who built castles and fought wars, were reduced in the end to helpless bodies breaking down under their own filth. Their deaths stripped away the illusion of majesty, leaving behind only the ugly truth of their hygiene. And yet, for all the horror of these endings, their stories were carefully hidden. Chronicles often softened the details, painting their deaths as peaceful or noble. But whispers of the truth always survived, and they tell us more about medieval royalty than their portraits ever could. As medieval kings aged, their already poor hygiene habits only worsened. Their bodies became fragile, and the lack of medical knowledge made their final days horrifying. Corpses were often left unwashed, their skin covered in sores and rot. The smell of death filled their castles long before they were buried. One example was King Henry VIII of England. His body was swollen, diseased, and covered with festering ulcers. When he died in 1547, his coffin was sealed quickly, but the gases from his decaying body caused it to burst open. Eyewitnesses described how his remains leaked onto the church floor, and dogs were seen licking the spilled fluids. Another infamous case was King Louis XIV of France. In his old age, he suffered from gangrene that spread across his body. The smell was so unbearable that courtiers fainted when entering his chamber, even though he was the Sun King, the brightest monarch of his age. He died surrounded by darkness, rot, and the stench of decay. These endings reveal the ugly truth. Even the most powerful men in history could not escape the consequences of poor hygiene. Their bodies betrayed them, leaving behind horrifying scenes that shocked all who witnessed them. The so-called divine rulers were reduced to grotesque reminders of human fragility. In the end, the kings who once demanded gold, obedience, and worship met the same fate as the peasants they ruled. Their deaths were not grand or glorious, but disgusting and humiliating. Castles that once echoed with power now carried the unbearable smell of rot. But this raises a haunting question. If kings lived and died in filth, what does it say about the world they built for those who served beneath them? The horrific hygiene of medieval kings is more than a tale of personal disgust. It reflects the broken world they ruled. These monarchs built empires, waged wars, and shaped history. But behind the crowns and thrones lay a reality of filth, disease, and decay. Their castles, which appeared majestic from the outside, often reeked of waste and unwashed bodies. The peasants lived in dirt because their kings did too. The stench of their lives followed them into death. Rotting corpses, bursting coffins, and festering wounds told a story that history tried to polish but could never erase. The legends of Henry VIII, Louis XIV, and countless other rulers are still remembered today, not only for their power, but also for the grotesque way their bodies failed them. In truth, their hygiene secrets were not just about bad smells or dirty habits. They revealed the limits of power itself. No crown could protect a king from infection. No throne could shield him from the smell of his own rotting flesh, and no amount of gold could cleanse a body when decay finally took hold. Their legacy reminds us that history is not just about glorious battles and shining palaces. It is also about the shadows behind the throne, the sores, the stench, and the silence of courtiers, too afraid to speak of the truth. The kings who demanded worship were, in the end, consumed by the same filth they ignored. Their reigns proved one lasting lesson. Power can command armies, but it can never conquer decay.